I've been approached a few times to, collaborate on a textbook, do a Canadian adaptation of an American textbook, and I've always turned it down because, thinking about adapting some textbook that was written in the 1970s and doing the 15th edition just didn't appeal to me because it didn't look like the kind of economics I thought was exciting and modern. What really turned me around with this project was just the quality of what we were starting with, what Betsy and Justin put together, just centered around students at the center, centered around economic decision-making as a central point for life, and really taking a modern approach to economics that I thought was a project that I could get behind.
For me, economics has changed a lot in the last several years in a way to make it more interesting. There's been just so many more applications that economics has been applied to in really interesting ways that makes it really fascinating for students. I think that Betsy and Justin's textbook has done justice to that, to try to share that new excitement.
One of the important things we've done with the Canadian version of the textbook is to embed, Canadian institutions, whether that's for how the federal budget works and what the federal government spends money on, but also how things like the Bank of Canada works and how it's different than the Federal Reserve. Just as one example of that, Canada is, a great example of a small open economy. And so Canada is much more trade dependent, much more dependent on being able to place our bonds in international markets than perhaps the United States is, where it's a much bigger domestic economy. So that plays into how you want to think about what the Bank of Canada does in terms of its ability to affect the Canadian economy and how it does it, the tools that it uses, and the constraints that are upon it, being a country that depends a lot more on its exchange rate than other countries might.
We didn't just want to take the textbook that Betsy and Justin put together and change the words US and Canada. I think we wanted to adopt it more as our own. And Kevin and I have a lot of experience in both macro and micro, and wanted to incorporate that into the text with our own style. And that meant changing a lot of parts of the text to include specific Canadian examples, sometimes more emphasis on decision-making and time for me. And I think there were just a lot of opportunities for us to want to change major parts that we think would appeal to the kinds of students that we teach.
Looking at the business cycle, the Great Recession from the financial crisis was really very different how it played out in Canada. And understanding that and how it was different than the US really plays out on how you teach these things, because it had a very different role in Canada in thinking about how it impacted the macroeconomy.
I'm a little partial on some of these examples. My favorite one is probably the one I did when I sent out thousands of resumes across Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, and randomized the name to explore what might happen when the resume being sent in response to a job applicant had a Anglo-Saxon name versus a name that was more ethnic sounding, to explore questions around why immigrants don't tend to do as well in the labor market. So, we shared that example among others as something that's very much Canadian and Canadian focused.
The best textbook authors were A, strong researchers, and B, good communicators. And I've had some experience in the policy world and in doing media appearances that I'm pretty comfortable with communicating to a broader audience. And both Phil and I have some experience as researchers we can bring, so we can bring in that cutting edge research to the textbook and make it accessible to students to get them as excited about economics as we are. What I see in the experience of the last 20 years as things like the financial crisis and bursting real estate bubbles and other shocks hit the economy, is that the way economics has evolved is that it's really dynamic, that we now really pay close attention to the data and pay close attention to what empirical studies say. And then we go back and we revise the theory and think about theory more subtly, and don't take theory as something written down and never to be changed, but as something that's dynamic that should respond to what we see in the world, in the data around us. And that's what I think we're trying to incorporate in this textbook, is that modern approach where you're anchored in the data and then thinking about how that informs how we think about the theory that we put together.
Looking at issues in microeconomics, big and small. And a lot of that has been through sort of these mini quasi experiments that allow us to tell really convincing stories for trying to answer very specific questions. Some of those questions can be interesting in their own right on just trying to understand human behavior, like using changes in prices of Uber, commuting with an Uber to try to understand how do people value time. Other cases are more direct for policy, like trying to set up experiments and trying to provide kids more tutoring and seeing the kind of benefits that come out from that. So there's a lot of collective little examples that we're excited to share and put throughout in the textbook. Instead of what superhero I would be, it would be what would be my superpower. And as always, I wish I could freeze time. I don't have enough time, and I could do so much more if I had more time. And so without question, if I had a superpower and could be a superhero, it would be the power to freeze time.
Well, I'm going to choose Superman, and specifically for the power not to move heavy buildings or whatever, but to fly. Be able to fly, and I can top Phil's, because you can use that fly around the world and reverse time technique. So I can fly and change time. Phil, what do you think of that?
That's pretty good.